But I would now like to introduce the speakers for session 2, which is the letter of the faithful. So first is Allyson Carr, who is the Associate Secretary of Justice Ministries in the Presbyterian Church of Canada. Allyson convenes the theology group of For the Love of Creation. Then Dr. Sylvia Keismack, who is a biblical scholar, activist, and farmer. She obtained her doctorate at Oxford University, studying with N.T. Wright, and has most recently taught as an adjunct professor of biblical studies at Trinity College at the Toronto School of Theology. Sylvia lives at Russet House Farm, which is an off-grid permaculture farm in the Kawartha Lakes, which is on the traditional territory of the Michi-Sagig Anishinaabe. And then we'll hear from Sister Eva Solomon, who has been sorry? Okay, yeah, we're going to be hearing then from Sister Eva Solomon, who has been most recently Director of Building Bridges Project for the Assembly of Western Catholic Bishops Standing Committee on Indigenous Relations. Eva has a strong commitment to the development of a truly Indigenous Catholic Church. She has worked for many years with her own Anishinaabe, people, and with many other Indigenous people of Canada, Mexico, and USA. In her traditional way, Sister Eva is a sacred pipe carrier and sweat lodge leader and conducts various other traditional ceremonies. So looking forward to this next session. Over to you, Allyson.
Thank you. As Willard said, I am one of the conveners of the Theology Working Group. And this next panel was first meant to look at a process and a letter of the faithful. But over the past several days, as we were working steadily away, finalizing details on what's been a 1.5-year long process to come to this point, something happened that made us reconsider. And so this panel will still be looking at that process that took us here and the letter that it produced. But it's also going to start with this introduction and a bit of a confession and some lessons that we, the Theology Working Group, are learning. When For the Love of Creation began as an initiative, we recognized that as we network and advocate for changes in policies and practices to respond to this climate crisis, we can act with even deeper conviction when we act out of our faith commitments. And in a very real way, those beliefs about the world and our relationships with each other and what we understand as the Creator's call, our faith commitments, shape the way that we act and that we interact. But how those beliefs are influencing us and even understanding all of what our beliefs are isn't always immediately apparent. And yet they're present, shaping our actions and our language. More on that in a minute. So we figured in a group that was made up of people from many different denominations, all Christian at first, though that has changed, and I'll get to that in a minute too, it would be good to talk about how our various faith commitments and how they were informing our actions around climate change. We expected that in reflecting on how our theologies, plural, even at the beginning, shape our understanding of creation, we would learn from each other and hopefully forge better ways, again, plural, of relating with creation and grounding our response to this climate crisis in our deepest faith commitments. And so our mandate as the Theology Working Group, one of the 3 working groups within the larger For the Love of Creation initiative, was to find ways to encourage theological reflection on issues of climate justice. That mandate led us to try something different, not developing explanatory resources telling people what, for example, a theology of climate justice is, but rather really trying to get people engaged in thinking and talking, dialogue about faith and faith commitments in the context of this climate crisis. So we developed a conversation guide to be used by whoever wanted. But we also felt that people would be more likely to engage the conversation if doing so was part of a larger process, not just a one-time thing. It was through that desire to keep conversation going and deepen dialogue that the concept for a letter of the faithful was born. We created a fillable form posted online and accessed through our conversation guide that we created, where people could submit feedback and responses, which we stated would then be read and drawn on in order to write a letter, this letter of the faithful, an epistle in the Pauline sense of the word, meant to weave the themes we found in the responses together and then present them back to the communities to reflect on and dialogue with them, hopefully sparking new conversations. The 4 main question prompts that we asked people in the guide to reflect on, meant to be the structure of the letter we would then write, were first, to name some important themes in what they might consider a theology of ecological love, care, and justice for creation. Second, to name what people were experiencing fear and loss regarding. Thirdly, to name what, if anything, was giving us hope and a sense of possibility. And fourth, an open-ended question that we worded as, when we say Christians are called to pursue justice and we live in a context of climate change, we mean fill in the blank. These questions generated a lot of detailed responses once the guide had been published and animated through our networks. There were approximately 60 submissions, most of them from separate conversations across Canada, and the conversations ranged anywhere in size from just 3 people to more than 40. There were a lot of similarities that we found, as well as differences, as members of the working group read the responses and drafted the letter. Some highlights include that many people responded to the first question about themes by speaking of a belief that all of creation is interconnected, and that we must treat all of creation with respect, that God's love or wisdom is revealed in nature, and so we should learn from it. And so we wove that into our letter. We found too that people shared many of the same fears and were grieving similar losses. Fear of extinction and what the world will be for children and grandchildren, grief over biodiversity loss, and a feeling of powerlessness in the face of government inaction. We wove this into the letter. We found too that hope was more varied than fear. While every single participant who answered could name something that gave them hope, what they named differed much more widely than in the fears and losses section. But there were some themes that emerged, especially around increasing knowledge of the effects of climate change, increasing understanding, the activism of youth leadership, and hope in God. And so we wove all that into the letter. We found that people were also able to name the connections between their faith commitments and the call to take action regarding climate change. We wove those themes that emerged into the letter as well, saying our faith and Christian scripture, as well as the sacred texts of other faith traditions, call us to advocate for ecological justice as a form of creation care and to take better responsibility for the care of creation. This means transforming the forces of marginalization by giving special attention to the vulnerability of those most affected by our changing climate, both human and non-human. These are just some of the highlights of the letter, but the process also revealed several issues in our process. First, when we started writing the Theology Conversation Guide, For the Love of Creation was still comprised of all Christian organizations. But by the time we were finished writing the guide, people of several faiths had become involved in the initiative. And in fact, responses to the conversation guide included a small number from people who identified themselves as Muslim or Baha'i, or in one case, Wiccan. But of course, the way that we had worded that 4th question was specific to Christian faith, and so excluded some of the participants. Going forward, this is something we will have to address as the initiative continues its growth from ecumenical into multi-faith. Second, we tried to animate the guide as best we could But participation was, of course, voluntary, and the letter was limited in who and what it could represent by who participated. And we realized as the year went on that we were lacking many voices around the table. Notably, many of the very voices the letter we were writing was saying needed to be heard. This came into sharp focus when, after several rounds of analyzing responses, editing, and drafting, we sent it out, the letter, to organizations involved in the For the Love of Creation with an invitation to endorse it. And we received many endorsements, right up until about 3 days ago, when a group that we had invited to endorse the letter declined, along with the feedback that one of the calls we made at the end of the letter, a call to, quote, listen to others, particularly Indigenous peoples, those who have been marginalized, and traditional wisdom keepers, had the impact in how it was worded by talking about listening to others of actively othering and therefore marginalizing Indigenous people within our faith communities, implying that Indigenous people aren't already part of our faith communities. Hearing that feedback was very difficult. That we had not intended to do so was moot. The impact was there, and we had not noticed it in our language. After some regrouping, we agreed that the language would have to be changed and the release of the letter delayed to give us a chance in order to make those changes well. We also agreed that it would be important to name this criticism publicly today in introducing the letter, since the text that the panelists are responding to includes that language that will need to be rewriting. We hope that we'll be able to release a revised letter that people can consider signing on if they choose later. But first, we have to address the issues present in this text. And so we don't want to sweep them under the carpet, but name the failing in the language, apologize, and work to change it. It is tempting when we make mistakes to rush past them. And there is still so much in this letter that is good, that is worth highlighting, not least of which was the feedback from so many of the participants that the process of having these conversations was deeply helpful and deeply meaningful, a source of hope and strength. I hope that our two panelists who have been sitting with the letter and reflecting on it in the presentation to respond today may have more to say about some of those better things in the letter, even as they may also have critical points to raise, not least of which may be this concern. But we started out this process 1.5 years ago, hoping to deepen theological engagement and to spark theological conversation. And this is right where we find ourselves today. Many of the participants in the Letter of the Faithful process named damaging forces at work in society. Among those forces people named were exploitative economic structures, systemic racism, and colonialism, all of which have systemic reach. It's the nature of something systemic that, unless actively resisted, and sometimes even then, it finds its way into everything, even our relationships, even our language, even our working for justice. At the beginning of this introduction, I said that beliefs about the world, our relationships with each other, and what we understand as the Creator's call shape the way we act and interact in ways that aren't always immediately apparent. But other forces also shape those beliefs, because humans are shaped by our environment. Again, not always in ways we want or recognize. And so I told myself, in staring at that feedback that our language had othered and marginalized, that I should not be surprised when something systemic but sinful manifests in our work too, even as we work for justice. Once it's seen or pointed out, we're called to address and change it. Every faith community I know teaches in one way or another that we must love one another, even if we humans tend to struggle to live up to that call. And love does not allow marginalization. The present text of the Letter of the Faith the Letter of the Faithful calls for a significant cultural shift, a conversion of the heart. in order to address the climate crisis facing us all. But I think it's clear that these things, a significant cultural shift and a conversion of the heart, are needed in more than simply our climate crisis. They're also needed on the issues of systemic racism and colonialism that are, coincidentally, some of the primary drivers of our climate crisis. It's never easy to hear that the language that you intended to help instead caused harm. But in order to have the conversion of heart that we need, hearing such things is necessary. In speaking with the group that offered the critical feedback, kickstarting this process of reframing our presentation here and delaying the release of the letter, I heard and experienced, again, the importance of dialogue, of having voices continually present at the table, of relationship and of time to talk, time to listen, time to relate, rather than time seen primarily as a timeline toward a deadline. And while the climate crisis is urgent, and in a very real sense, time is pressing, we also need to make time for reflection, for true and full consultation, dialogue, so that we can have time to truly work together. And with that, I will hand it over to Sister Ava Solomon, our first respondent. Thank you.
Sister Eva, you need to unmute.
Sorry, I asked, is it really me who is supposed to be speaking? Because earlier it was Dr. Allyson Carr and then Dr. Sylvia Keismack and then me as the third speaker. So I'm just wondering, does that make any difference?
No, I think you can, I don't think so. I think you can
Okay.
carry on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciated what you said, Allyson, and I went about this letter asking some questions, because in the past, particularly when we did the let the rivers flow, be an act of trying to explain the churches and the residential schools, I found that very often we were, as Indigenous people, we were called in at the last minute to endorse something that everybody else wrote, instead of being part of the writing group itself and sharing what our thinking was at the time. So it made me question right away when you talk about the theology working group. What percentage of Indigenous people were part of the writing of this? And I leave it with you to look at and think about for the next time. And when you speak of the Love of Creation campaign for learning, theological reflection, and advocacy in action, in recent decades, we've witnessed many signs of progress in education ourselves, and taking steps more ecologically sustainable in dialogue with Indigenous people and traditions especially. And how much have we done that? And then we've also witnessed signs of cascading ecological crisis around the world. Extreme weather, heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, and floods. And I even ask something that I really wonder about, and that happens to be wind farms. Because we hear people, scientists saying, when a butterfly flaps its wings, it is felt on the other side of the world. If that is so, then what's happening when these great wind farms flap their wings, if you will? And is that also a new form of disturbing our environment? At the same time, a growing chorus of voices point to a looming apocalypse, ending the world as we know it. The future of the earth and human civilization is in question. Well, the future of the earth and of human civilization is not dependent on us. It's dependent on God and the way God chooses to allow the things that we do to either destroy or build up the earth. When building on these discussions and drawing on the insights of different traditions, we offer this letter on behalf of the conversation participants and FLC members. In that case, it may be one small step of toward shared understanding and solidarity and collaboration in forging another future. Will that be a better future or just another one? This is a critical question for life on this planet. And what have we to say on whether it is a better future or just another future? Time is running out to bring the needed healing that we want. And there's strong resistance to a transition from fossil fuel dependency to a green economy. And a lifestyle feeds further fears. We fear for the living on the next generation and for all life on Earth, especially those humans and non-humans who are the most vulnerable. The pain of loss is real and deep when we look at the science that has set before us. Tied to this sense of the erosion of values for the common good, as nationalism and denominationalism and exploitative economy and greed take control. And I say, wow. There is hope. It is still alive. And it's shown itself more commonly in the COVID-19 pandemic, as the earth began to heal with the decreased use of cars and other fossil fuels made a difference. And the fact that not many people could travel, it made a difference. But how quickly did we jump, or will we jump, to going back to air flights? seeking God's presence within the process of healing and regeneration deepens our spirituality, and it also strengthens our hope. But it also affects the process of healing and regeneration of our plant life and our animal life. We're reminded that we too are creatures. We are part of nature, not set apart from it. We too are God's creatures. Since creation is the first revelation of God, I think of the Indigenous people as what may be closer to that revelation of God because of the difference in time and development in the society. They have not had as much time as the European-based peoples, and the settlers who came with various different attitudes and both spoken and unspoken. They have become various and continued. And when we look at the teachings of the Indigenous people and we experience a sense of awe in the infinite variety in nature that God holds glory is revealed in creation fully alive, we feel called to embrace a value diverse in our living. And then I wondered, because I know how I felt when I was invited to the church's story on residential schools, I wondered who wrote this paragraph about Indigenous wisdom. Did the Indigenous people write that? Or the settler people? It's inspiring a growing appreciation of the interconnectedness of life and a reclamation of a sense of belonging, of oneness with the earth. This wisdom is a source of learning on how to be in relationship with all creation in respectful and loving ways, for learning how to lead a good, life-sustaining legacy for generations to come. I think that the settler people are beginning to know this more clearly, but it's more because that the Indigenous people have continued to speak to that, and that regeneration and transformation is a presence in our lives. This regenerative nature reminds us that with God, all things are possible. Knowing that God is active among us, we as people of faith empowered to contribute to the healing and rebalancing of injustice with social, ecological, and economic relationships. And our sister Allyson Carr mentioned particularly the knowledge that has come during the pandemic of grievances. And a second, the knowledge of political change possibilities. We need to really begin to see those as our channels of change. In my own community, we have been, for many, many years, probably the whole 140 years of our existence here, we have been very much concerned about those who are the most vulnerable. About 140 years ago in Thunder Bay, that was the call of our sisters when a man working for the railway. I saw that man sitting in a corner of a shed, and his feet were on the other side of the wall because he had been blasted, and he would die if we didn't do something with him. And we opened our house. That was the beginning of our first hospital in Thunder Bay. So we need to ensure the good of all creation. This means transforming the forces of marginalization by giving special attention to the vulnerability of those most affected by our changing climate, both human and non-human. And when I think of that, I think of the people up in Nunavut, where they just had that problem with their water, and there's no other choice for them to have other water. So they look at what society has done by bringing oil and doing what oil does to many people, and what it also does to the non-human people, the animals and the ducks and the caribou. And that conversion has to happen now. And then when I looked at the points on page 4, we said we need to work at a local level to protect, restore, and regenerate diverse ecosystems. I think that's important, but I wonder how many of us really think of planting a tree. I know I have planted many trees in my life, some beside the university in Thunder Bay, and some in Vancouver, and some up north in northern communities, some at Anishinaabe Spiritual Center as well. Because the more we plant those trees, the more we can improve the air. And if we can improve our air, it will make some difference in how the air can be affected or improved by all the flights that go across the land. If we learn to be respectful, humble allies with all struggle for a more just and sustainable world.
Eva, are we almost finished?
Yep.
Your
2 sentences.
Okay, thank you.
If we work with people of different cultural and spiritual traditions to build movements and communities for creation, that means, again, we have to include others from the very beginning in our plans, instead of just asking them to approve them. And so I thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva, for your very, very good, thoughtful comments. Appreciate that input very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and now Dr. Sylvia Keismack.
Thank you. I realized in the bio that I submitted for this, I had neglected a sentence about the place where you can actually find out more about me and my teaching. So I've just put a link to Bible Remixed in the chat if anybody's interested in that. I'd like to thank Eva for those wise and indeed challenging words. And I hope that my comments will be complementary to them. And I decided to frame my comments as a letter in response to this letter. So, dear For the Love of Creation campaign members, I write to you from my home on the traditional lands of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, currently called the Kawartha Lakes, in the month after the end of the wild rice harvest. As you have so deeply and movingly articulated in your letter, this is a time of lament and a time of loss. And while I understand your fear for the future, for the lives of your children and the life of the earth and the lives of all living creatures, I wonder if our lament should be more deeply rooted in grief rather than fear. You see, while trust and love are supposed to help cast out fear, grief is actually rooted in love. It was because Creator so deeply delighted in creation. Remember that frame from Genesis 1? It is good, tov, tov, tov in Hebrew. Yes, this is great. Because Creator so deeply loved the plants, trees, and the flyers, the four-legged creatures and the swimmers, and us, the earth creatures. Because of this love, Creator was full of grief in Genesis chapter 6 over the violence with which humanity had filled the earth. Creator was deeply grieved, the text tells us, deeply grieved in Creator's heart. And that grief, that lament at the heart of Creator is echoed not only by the earth, and it is throughout the biblical story by the earth, but also by us, the earth creatures, as we see the devastation that surrounds us, the loss of the rusty-patched bumblebee and the blue corner butterfly, the increasing silence of the spring as the peepers disappear, and the increasing darkness of the night as the fireflies are diminished, the barrenness of our lakes when the wild rice disappeared. So our lament is rooted in grief, and our deep sorrow is not only for the loss of places and creatures that we have loved, but also for the loss of the voices that offered praise and witness to Creator. All of creation was to teach us about who Creator is, Paul says in Romans 1. What about Creator will we be unable to know now that the five-lined skink is disappearing? What did the king rail teach us about Creator, or the red-headed woodpecker, or the loggerhead shrike, or the salmon no longer in our rivers? What will we never learn about Creator now that these voices are close to being silenced? So our lament should be a cry of mourning, but our lament should also be a cry of remorse. Remorse for the ways that we have hastened the death of other creatures. Remorse for our own complicity in desiring a life of comfort and convenience and the violence that such comfort and convenience inflicts on the earth and on the peoples living in deep harmony with the waters and the forests and the creatures that nourish us in so many ways. You see, we know what creation was supposed to look like. We know that Creator's original plan was to hang out in a forest by a river with a whole diversity of creatures and a couple of naked vegetarians. And we know that Creator's hope to live in relationship with us and all of creation has gone wrong in devastating ways, largely because of us. And so we grieve. So in the face of such lament, I was encouraged to read of the hope that you have. And while I too am encouraged by the various initiatives that have restored ecosystems, that have brought youth together and energized people of faith, I wonder if that's enough to nourish hope, or if that's just enough to create optimism. I wonder if real hope lies in the faith that you then outline in more detail as your letter progresses. This is a hope that is nourished by remembering that we form the web of life together with all creation, that we were formed from the earth along with all other creatures, plants, and trees, that we are all kin and relation. This is a hope that is nourished by remembering not only that we are to care for creation, which you emphasize, but that our first calling is to serve and observe our creaturely kin in Genesis 2:15, knowing that only by deeply immersing ourselves in the rhythms of creation, as you do note, and in the life ways of its creatures, will we be able to know how to appropriately serve it. This is a hope nourished by remembering that not only are all plants and animals interrelated, but that all of creation has intricate and intimate homes for all creatures, not only the homes of mountains and trees and streams for birds and goats and fish, but also a temporal home for the creatures of the night, as Psalm 104 tells us. While daytime is for us, for humans. This, by the way, has profound ecological significance. This is a hope that is found in our Indigenous stories and traditions, whether those stories are in our cultural memory from those Indigenous traditions found in the Christian scriptures, or the Indigenous traditions from the fishers and farmers in La Via Campesina, the global peasants movement around the world, or the Indigenous traditions that have shaped Turtle Island. We all have roots connected to the land somewhere in our history, recent or distant past, roots that not only can be reclaimed, but roots and wisdom that can be shared to nourish all of us as we journey together in gratitude for the gifts that Creator has surrounded us with. And let me be clear, I'm an immigrant. My family's an immigrant family, so my roots are in the past, the deep past. This is a hope that is also found, as you say, in Creator's presence among us, working for regeneration, for healing, and for transformation. As you know, Creator's healing presence is seen in the basic rhythms of the earth, the cycles of death and rebirth, the turning of compost and leaf mold into earth, death into life. The soil, in other words, is the place where resurrection happens. And this, most fundamentally, is the way that Creator interacts with the world, bringing healing out of brokenness and life out of death. And this should be the most radical basis of our hope. We believe in resurrection. And in the words of Wendell Berry, we are called to practice resurrection. And given that hope, it is no surprise that your calls are deep and wide-ranging calls for justice, for care for the vulnerable, calls for listening and allyship across traditions and cultures. But I wonder if you have not dug deeply enough here. For you have called us to personal and ecological conversion, but I wonder if conversion is possible without repentance. And here I'm reminded of the words of that great Canadian prophet Leonard Cohen, who said, when they said repent, I wondered what they meant. So maybe the language of neither repentance nor conversion resonates with people in our culture. But let me put it this way, unless our lament is one of remorse, unless our lament acknowledges our own role in destroying land, water, and habitat, unless we realize that it is our own habits of eating food from far away and out of season, our own desire for easy to wash clothing made with microfibers and polyesters in bright, non-fade colors, our own assumptions that speed and air travel are how we recreate ourselves on holidays, as Sister Eva mentioned when talking about in her response, our own right to live in warmth all winter and in refreshing coolness in the summer. Unless we realize that conversion means dramatically changing our way of life, we'll have mild reforms, but not radical conversion. Conversion will not happen. Such a conversion begins in lament and remorse, but we can't stay there. As someone who was raised a Calvinist, I know that guilt is a poor motivator. So in the end, we need to be called forward out of the story of destruction that shapes our world into a new vision, a new story. All of the calls outlined in the letter, friends, are important, but unless they project a vision of how the world can be, unless they create a narrative that people can embrace and step hopefully into, unless they create a world that people can't help but want to live into, they will be difficult for people to indwell. So what if we told the story, the foundational story of our faith? What if we said this is a story of Creator forming us from the earth in love, Adam from Adama, earth creature from the earth, along with trees and plants, the flyers and swimmers, the four-legged and the crawlers. This is a story where we are called to learn about and delight in creation, to become its servant for the flourishing of all. And this is also a story where we refused to live within limits, took food that was not on offer, that was out of season, and a story where the abuse of the land and greed over its resources results in mourning and grief for the Creator, for the creatures, for the land, and for us. And this is a story where hospitality and generosity for the stranger, the vulnerable, the marginalized, animals, for the land, create a new community, where only by offering ourselves up, by sacrificing the privilege that some of us have, by sacrificing our own desires and comfort, in short, by offering our lives in service and gratitude for creation and all creatures, for all peoples, only then will we be able to bring reconciliation and healing. And of course, when we know the end of the story, when we can imagine a world where cities and forests have clean rivers running through them, where fruit and nut trees provide food for all year long, where peace and justice permeate the gardens and the forests at the center of our communities, where every child knows how to climb a tree, pick a peach, wonder at a swallowtail, and mimic the white-throated sparrow, where every child knows how to plant the three sisters, harvest the wild rice with Thanksgiving and dance, make a birch bark container and seal a canoe. If this is a world we can picture, the sacrifices we need to make become not a chore, but a joyful step along a journey towards hope, towards that renewed earth where all creatures can flourish. So I pray, friends, that such a vision animates your work, that such a vision will ground your hope, and that the Spirit of Creator, who invites us into a world of abundance, will give you strength for the journey. And now back to Will.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, all three presentations. My goodness, very, very rich, very provocative, I think. Lots to be able to dialogue with. So yeah, this very I would say very moving for all of us. It is some very good comments. So we'll have some questions. If you have questions for any of the three, put them into the chat box, and we'll be pulling them all together. I certainly have. I do like the comments you made, Sylvia, of sort of that recognition of what of the Creator will we not be able to understand when some of the created beings no longer exist, right? Because they all reflect part of the Creator, and our best understanding is when we have more and more of the Creator's expressions that we can see and understand. So I hadn't quite had that thought posed to me before. So thank you. Okay, so maybe, yeah.
If I may just interrupt, just for point of process, if you do have a question, to send it directly to me, Beth Lormer, in the chat, as I believe you're only able to message one of us directly, and I will compile similar questions together and pass them on to Willard through the chat.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great.
So maybe we'll start with questions about the letter. Will the theology group be working with Indigenous communities in communication and validating with them as they revise the letter? Is that part of the plans?
I think that's really the only way to go forward.
And a follow-up then, will a draft of the letter be shared, or would that be part of the plan as well?
I'll have to check with the rest of the theology group, because that's not something that we've spoken about yet. But it's certainly something that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Okay. appreciation, Sylvia, for your deep insight and the poetry of your reflection. But the questions to you, Sylvia, are, isn't fear, in fact, also rooted in love? Don't we fear for those we love because we love them? Don't we fear for our earth because we love her? Don't we fear for our own lives because we love life? So maybe some reflection on that.
Yeah, that those things are true. I think they are true. All I can say is this hasn't been my experience myself. that the lament I experience about what's happening here in the Kawartha Lakes to the land is rooted in fear. It is, and I find this that's my students have some fear, but more often they are in places of mourning. And in a place of lament that's rooted in grief over places that have been lost. And I think, let me put it this way, what motivates people to work for the preservation and the regeneration of places is that they love those places, that they love their watersheds, that those places have been places of healing for them, that the animals of those places have spoken to them, that the trees are places where they have experienced home. And so while fear is a more amorphous feeling about what might happen, I think grief and lament are rooted in what we already love, that is being lost or might be lost. So I think that's, in my experience, that is just a more has been a more widespread feeling around lament, grief, and I mean maybe anxiety is a better word than fear. Eco-anxiety is huge, right? This is why all of our young people under the age of 25 are on, antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, including my own children who grew up in the woods and then moved to the city. So that's that's just a bit of, I don't think fear kind of captures the depth of what people are feeling across the board. I guess I would put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm wondering if I might invite Eva also just to reflect on sort of fear, love, the interaction. Yeah, do you have any thoughts to share, Eva? And again, I'll just invite you, Eva, to unmute yourself.
Well, when I think of my childhood, fear was very much a part of it, in the sense that either someone older or our parents would tell us, you be home by 6:30 or something will happen and the boogeyman will come, or whatever. And so I remember coming home one night from Aunt Agnes's, and I was only about 3 years old, and there were 2 fields between us, 2 acres of land. And when I was coming home, and it wasn't very dark out, but it was near dusk, I could see in the distance some horses, and I always thought of them as wild horses. So I thought, if I go fast, they're going to stampede me. And that was my first experience of personal, real prayer, because I said, if I can make myself walk very slowly and pray, then I'll be taken care of. And I remember walking very slowly through Aunt Agnes's field, because that's where the horses were. And I remember saying, Jesus, save us, Jesus, save us, Jesus, save us. That's all I could do to force myself to walk slowly. And then when I got to our fence and went through it, then I could run. And so I feel there's a way where fear is also helpful. It's not totally that it destroys us, but it allows us another place to see God in nature, in the wild horses, if you will. But I think that fear can also sort of demonstrate that hope of a better life. Because as soon as I was in my own yard, it was better. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that stands with me. And another was an experience I had. I was in my house, and I saw a very strange thing as I looked out the window, because it was starting to rain and thunder, and I saw this ball of light, and it went from one post and it arched and went to the next post, and it arched again and went to the next post. And I called my mother to come and see it. And she said, just leave it alone. So I knew that what I had seen was real, and there was some kind of respect that I had to show to that thing. And each time I would ask somebody, an elder, about that, they'd ask another question. And one of the questions that was asked a number of times was, are your parents still alive? I said, yes. Oh, that's good. And that was the end of the conversation, so I never got anywhere with it.
Mm.
And only today, in our time, I've been able to understand that there is a kind of lightning that's called ball lightning, and it does travel like that. So I feel comfortable with it now, but for many, many years, 30 some years, I couldn't understand what it was.
Okay. Certainly the question of motivation, I think, is a critical question when we're in a situation where we need to see change happen. And so what motivates people the best, and that's partly what we're trying to figure that out. Is it is it fear, is it guilt, or is it even in the name of this initiative for the love? It's a love, it's an appreciation, like what? So really, yeah, I mean, I've been struggling with this one a long time, right? Because we need to get as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, to become engaged. And what's the motivator for large groups of people to get engaged? That's a key question. So maybe back to Sylvia again. The question here is, I hear you calling us to more radical action, but that also seems to require systemic action, right? So how can we pursue some of this radical action within systems and a society that make that reality challenging? Is that even possible, or do we need systemic action first?
Well, I think we need. I think the answer to that is both and. I mean, what a systemic thing that we've been involved with here recently is a developer that has moved into the neighborhood, is throwing money around, and is now requesting ministerial zoning orders to build on, prime agricultural and protected land. And so, we spent the last couple of weeks at City Council making deputations, right? We think some systemic things need to happen, but also there are people doing things that that can have that have a real impact in shaping communities, even without the cooperation at those systemic levels. So I'm thinking about in urban areas in England, where the transition town movement is relocalizing economics, because our economics are going to have to change, right? Capitalism is what's eating up the world, and so they are relocalizing economies, creating community around sustainable food systems and food sovereignty. There's just this, so that's a movement that's happening at a grassroots level that is creating change that is far reaching. There are also people working on Indigenous food sovereignty, and particularly there's one farmer who is in Black and Indigenous in the States. I think his name is Chris Newman. I'm pretty sure. I'll check that. Who is setting up programmatic ways that whole watersheds and food sheds can be created in spite of what's happening at a national or a state level, and kind of reimagining communities, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, allies, working together to create whole food sheds that can work for the protection of those watersheds and food sheds. If you think of Leah Penniman, who wrote Farming While Black, and the whole movement around the Black, Indigenous, and people of color farming movement, and what's happening there to reconnect people to the land and learn from the wisdom of various traditions. And, the Ecological Farmers Association in Ontario is now starting initiatives to reconnect Black, Indigenous, people of color to the land. I shouldn't say starting initiatives, tapping into initiatives, working with things that are already happening. So there are a lot of grassroots movements that are taking off and making a difference and challenging systemically what's happening, which isn't to say that we can stop pushing for those systemic changes. But if we wait for them, we are screwed. Right? That's going to be the end. If we wait for the government to solve these problems, it's only when enough people have already created, I think, an upswell, a tidal wave, that it's going to wash over our elected leaders, and it's going to dawn on them, oh, this actually matters. We need to make a change. Yeah.
Excellent. Maybe, and Allyson, I really appreciate, I think you're very confessional approach to this initiative, and the recognition that of how things should be done differently, could be done differently. So I guess the question is, as we look forward, what Indigenous ecumenical outreach will be incorporated in the letter going forward? How do we ensure in a voluntary process that we have a diversity of Indigenous voices throughout the process, and not just at the end asking them to sign? So how do we make that process welcoming? What are some thoughts on that?
Well, those really are the questions in front of the group right now, and that we've been talking about. In some cases, some of those questions actually throughout the last year and a half, and have failed to come up with answers to some of the questions, and are continuing to struggle with them. It was not our wish to ask people at the end, and any peoples, whether Indigenous, whether gender diverse, whether Black and people of color, and any number of different communities. But we kept running into the issue of, an invitation only goes so far, right? It's all about welcome and how welcome people feel. And I know that, and now I'm speaking as an academic, and not necessarily not necessarily representing everyone on the theology group. But I know that I have heard people saying, theology is scary. It's there's problems. It's caused issues in the past, and so sometimes there's a very, I think, understandable hesitancy to want to engage in it. And so one of the barriers that we're looking at trying to address is how can we take away barriers like that? How can we get better at reaching out and making the theology group a place where people of many different communities want to be there, want to be part of this, and so that's another thing that we're continuing to look at and will have to continue to look at. And so I wish I could answer that question fully and say, here are the concrete steps that we're going to take. But I don't have that answer right now. And we are looking at it, and we would love to hear if people have suggestions. I can say that we are going to be going back to our networks and trying to reconnect with Indigenous communities that many of us have connections with, and work in and amidst already on many other issues, and so without trying to deal with capacity.
Sylvia has put a couple suggestions in the chat of maybe some links there that you might find helpful.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Eva, I'm wondering, do you want to comment on this as well?
I'm sorry, I was distracted when Allyson was speaking, but we had planned with the University of St. Paul to continue to begin a dialogue with the theologians and Indigenous elders. And we were supposed to have that this past week. And as it happened, the two planners were not able to do it because Peter Bisson, who was a Jesuit in charge of the dialogue, had open heart surgery 2 days ago. And Michelle Andreas lost his dad 2 days before we had the gathering, so it was postponed. I hope we will continue and have it soon, but it was the beginning of a new dialogue that the theologians were asking or saying to the Indigenous elders, we want to know what you have to say to us that we can learn from. And so it's a new step altogether.
Good. Well, a number of Indigenous participants have offered their help.
That's right.
Guidance to the process in the chat. So
yeah,
definitely follow up on that, and thank you for those offers. Deeply appreciate that.